Welcome back, everybody. So South Africa has been announced the winner of the most favoured offshore CX delivery location for 2021. This is according to the annual Front Office BPO Omnibus survey on a study conducted in around about 300 countries. Now, the country has been ranked the top global location for business process services, beating India and coming first for the first time from its second position for the past 3 years. Now, the business services sector includes call centres, technical support such as IT and legal services for multinational as well as South African companies. Ntombizamasala Hlophe is a strategy director at Yellowwood, and she joins us now. Great to have you. Nice to have you on the program again. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. So, I mean, when people talk about CX delivery, offshore CX delivery, I think I gave a little bit of an explanation. I mean, we're talking for call centres, IT infrastructure, all of that kind of stuff. But maybe you can give us a proper understanding as to what this means for South Africa.
Sure. So it's effectively being able to provide back-end office support for any business in the world. So if you think about, for example, when you need to contact a large corporation and you're talking about customer service, effectively what you're trying to reach are the people who have the most amount of information about how the company functions, how it operates in relation to you directly. And so typically it takes on the form of call centers, it takes on the form of shared services for people who can service multiple queries using the same set of information.
Yeah. So here we are sitting in first position now, which really is a great feather in our cap, because I mean, whenever one thinks about this, we do tend to think India is, they've got this. They're the ones that have won this consecutively over and over again. What happened? I mean, what did we do right?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I think the first one is that we have to acknowledge the collaboration between government and the sector itself, and of course the rapid expansion of technology in our country. We can't really get around the fact that there's been a real concerted effort from the ministry to make this happen. But I think the second thing that really happened, and this is partly the conversation we keep having about the fourth industrial revolution, is that one of the biggest advantages countries like ours have is that we will use technology where it will be most needed. And I think while the rest of the world might be using technology to explore, to innovate things that might be considered a luxury, we absolutely, out of necessity, would have focused on the most important things. And so when the world needed to be very available, when the world needed access to large-scale people who can resolve issues immediately, we were then best placed to be able to respond. And I think that's the real secret to being ready for this digital transformation from an economy point of view. And I think the last thing that we probably really undervalue is the way that South Africans speak. Right? Globally, we're known for having one of the flattest accents in the world. We have a very high comprehension of the English language. And so when you think about the easiest place for people to be able to service multiple nationalities, South Africa becomes a very viable option. And I think those are some of the things that we really underestimate that contribute to this kind of preference.
Yeah, that is something that I was actually thinking about, because I mean, it is something that a lot of companies have spoken to, particularly internationally, is that we do tend to have an accent that people can understand as opposed to other countries. So that obviously held us in good regard. I mean, the other countries that really do offer competition to us, I mean, we spoke to India because they've always very much so dominated. Also the Philippines, Malaysia, Poland, Egypt and Northern Ireland. So those are the top contenders in the space, but we have now gone ahead and managed to get that number one global destination. If I'm not mistaken, the president even spoke to it or alluded to this in his letter yesterday to the nation. So this is quite a big deal. But how big a deal is it? I mean, what does it mean for the person who's watching this at home? I mean, it's well and good we're speaking about it, but does this translate into jobs? How is this going to help South Africans?
I understand. So I think firstly, it is an immensely big deal, because I think a lot of the theory that's been spoken about the digital economy and what's possible is being proven to be real. So the first thing is that there are absolutely jobs being created in this sector, and we would have seen it. And I know that there's also concern about increasing retrenchments in recent months, but very clearly the net effect is that this industry over the COVID-19 lockdown that we've experienced created new jobs. And so I think what it means for the average South African is when a lot of the conversation becomes about what is possible for new kinds of jobs, new kinds of industries, to understand that this is exactly what happens. Something that we couldn't do before, because we invest in technology, because we collaborate and we create connections between the different parts of our society, produces new skills. And most importantly, it produces skills that we can compete with as a labor force around the world, as opposed to only being a labor force that we must deal with in terms of customers within our own borders.
I mean, we heard words coming from the Trade and Industry Minister, Abraham Patel. I mean, to just quote him, he was saying, "The rapid expansion of business process services is a tribute to the skills of young South Africans and evidence of what South Africa has to offer as a business and investment destination." It's all well and good, but, in reality, it almost feels like this is a little bit of a contradiction if you consider that South Africa, as a country, has some of the highest numbers of unemployment when it comes to the youth and a skills shortage. I mean, how do we join these two scenarios?
This is probably the most difficult part, Leanne, because I think a big part of the conversation that we've been having about jobs and future of work and the labor market in South Africa is the understanding that the balance between where we were and the kinds of jobs we used to provide and the economy and industry we need to create, there's a big gap. And finding the way to transfer people who are currently working or perhaps looking for work into a new skill set is really what we have to focus on. And so when Minister Patel speaks about how this is a credit to the skills of young people, the truth is, as South Africans, we've spent the past perhaps 5 to more years complaining about how we're taking highly skilled graduates and placing them in call center jobs. We're taking people and putting them in shared services, and we've seen this as a negative. By contrast, the world looks at us and says, here's a workforce that has the capability to be able to use a skill to quickly understand information, to make it incredibly efficient. And I think that the gap is not dissimilar to what India did perhaps 10 years ago when they were very clearly the leader, is that they looked at their reality and then they said, how do we make that an advantage? So one of the reasons why India led for so long in this outsourcing field is because they had graduates doing some of the what feels like rudimentary work. But as a result, it meant that they were very efficient. It meant there were less mistakes being made because you have someone who has the intellectual capacity to deal with what is the next step after this conversation. And that becomes a very big advantage when companies are looking for what's the cheapest way that I can get the service provided, how efficient can it be done, and how excellently can it be executed. And I think what we really have to consider is what is the criteria for the different types of industries, and how do we make sure that we allow an industry to be as successful as possible within itself while connecting it to the rest of the economy so that everything balances out to a net positive.
Yeah. I mean, I was reading, I think, that Twitter, the company Twitter, are finally opening up a headquarters. And I see you know the story as well, but not in South Africa. They've decided to open their headquarters in Ghana. So that's quite a big development for that country. I mean, we're still waiting for the likes of something like an Apple to actually move into Africa and open up headquarters. I mean, we have retailers. We don't necessarily have the office, but we give them the business. I mean, I don't know where we stand in terms of that, but we do give companies the business, and yet do we benefit? And that's the big question. So, I mean, in some of the areas mentioned, they're not necessarily specialized skills that are needed. For example, call center needs computer skills. We've seen graduates in these jobs where people can be easily disposed of, as we have seen with call centers, and particularly during this time of coronavirus. What do we need to own as skills to create a strong base of a workforce that will impact the economy, that will attract these major companies back into South Africa, or to actually start off in South Africa?
I understand. I think firstly what we must acknowledge, I think, is also Amazon's commitment to hiring 3,000 South Africans within the next year as they move their headquarters into the country, specifically in the outsourcing field. But I think one of the things that we've got to look at when we're talking about the kinds of skills is how deliberate are we about the way we're going to take this leadership position into a market dominance position. And I think that's probably that's going to be the most important thing, is what do we do with this advantage? And I think the first thing we have to look at is how do we make sure that the industry remains as cost effective as possible. So typically in South Africa, we are not necessarily deliberate about where we locate certain industries. And I think that this is an opportunity for us to really think about, is there a part of South Africa that potentially from a business point of view has cheaper rent, where the ability for employees to travel to and fro might be cheaper and easier. And so perhaps instead of being obsessed with building the outsourcing industry in Johannesburg, should we consider placing it in Polokwane as a random example? But the reason why I say that is because it can give us the opportunity to place this industry where the skills are most needed, where it's easiest to make that transfer of skills from perhaps where people are losing jobs to where we could place them. And so that gap between losing a job and finding another one can be short-circuited. But also what it potentially allows us to do is to be very clear about how are we going to get dominance in terms of the volume of the labor force versus dominance in terms of the expertise of the labor force. And that's where we can start to think about where do we place a more highly skilled individual versus someone who is capable of doing some of the basic sets of skills. But with all of that said, I think one of the things that in our national discourse we have to be willing to appreciate is that only about 6% of available jobs are highly skilled. And that's just the truth of what the reality of this continent looks like. So we have to start accepting the longer term journey. And if I think of industries like banking, for example, some of the best, most successful people in banking are in that industry because they started at the more rudimentary roles. They started in the back end, they started in the teller roles. And I think that that's one of the things that we have to account for, is that there is value in being able to understand an industry inside out. Right. And it's not only just about having a qualification that accelerates you to the higher end of an industry. And I think that's part of what we would be able to do if we're quite deliberate about the way that we transform towards dominance in this outsourcing industry.
All right, let's leave it there. Thanks again. Thanks so much for talking to us. Ntombizamasala Hlophe, a strategy director at Yellowwood, giving her perspective on South Africa's job market following the country being ranked a top global location for business process services for multinational and local companies. As you heard, quite a big deal for the country. Right, quick break. We'll see you after this.